Hi, everyone.
Sure,
we have Dr. Pran Yoganathan here. Dr. Pran Yoganathan is a medical doctor and the director at the Centre for Gastrointestinal Health here in Sydney. I want to read a little excerpt from his website to kick things off so that you can get an idea of what he's about and how he and his fellow practitioners help people. So, I am a believer in the concept of modern lifestyles contributing to illness and disease. We are equipped with the knowledge to help guide our clients to achieve their best possible health. I am passionate about human health, and I believe our current approach of a drug-centric method is fraught with issues due to economic constraints. A comprehensive approach to healthcare encompassing nutrition is what is required, and my team will aim to provide this. So, Dr. Yoganathan, welcome. I'm wondering if you might be able to
Thank you,
share.
Simon. Appreciate you having me on.
I'm wondering if you might be able to share a little bit about who you are and the path that you've taken so far in your life to get to where you are right now.
Sure, mate. As you've said, I'm a gastroenterologist and a hepatologist. That's essentially a specialty that is involved with study and diseases of the digestive tract, which sort of covers everything from our oral cavity as in our mouth to our anal canal. It's really one 6-meter long tube, a very complex tube which serves different functions along the way. I've been a specialist now for many years. I've had a practice and I've been in gastroenterology for approaching almost a decade. And I am just kind of overwhelmed with the burden of disease, Simon, and I'm watching these trajectories of diseases which just rise every year, and chronic illnesses such as blood pressure and cholesterol and dementias and diabetes and obesity, heart disease, everything is just rising. Cancers, autoimmune illnesses, the list goes on. So it's just an overwhelming sense of futility, like it's sort of trying to plug the holes in the Titanic as it sinks, basically. And I'm just seeking a different approach, potentially, which looks at root cause for these illnesses rather than just kind of reach for the prescription pad, which I think is kind of what's pushed on us as practitioners. We're busy. Medical school doesn't really equip us with the tools to deal with nutritional and movement-related shortcomings in our population. So I'm seeking a different way of doing it with a multidisciplinary approach, which is on board with, which is why I've got about 4 dietitians on board with what we're trying to achieve.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Obviously, nutrition is a really big focus of what you do. I know that, speaking or doing a little bit of research into gastrointestinal health, there's not always a real focus on nutrition, which for me, it seems counterproductive. But I'd like to dig in a little bit deeper as to why you've decided to go for what you're describing as the root cause, and how you came to the conclusion that, it's time to challenge perhaps conventional nutrition as a possible prevention.
Sure. Simon, I mean, imagine a paradigm, which is the current paradigm in healthcare, which is that what you put into your gut has no impact on your gut symptoms. It's almost a laughable approach, which is, I think, the way historically gastroenterology has been looked at. I think we do have some evidence saying that the low FODMAP diet, which is fundamentally a low carbohydrate diet or a type of diet that seeks to eliminate some of these fermentable carbohydrates in our diet, is being well studied, and it has been shown to be efficacious in things like irritable bowel syndrome. But it's a very difficult diet to follow long term, because they say cut out all these foods, but they don't really give you an approach to increase specific macros to replace what you've removed. So from my perspective, I was pretty aware early on in my career that diet certainly impacts a person's ill health. It's the question of how do I arrive at a diet that helps people from a population-based perspective. And I think, I'm a big believer in personalized nutrition, and we've got to work out for an individual what best suits them, and that's dependent on age, weight, comorbidities, and various other factors. There's certain states like pregnancy and aging place and growth in children, which places a great deal of difference on nutritional requirements. But I'm very big on individualising care. But I knew very early on in the piece that our modern lifestyles, in particular diet, was contributing significantly to the burden of illness. And I think no doctor will shy away from stating that. It's just the question of, are they equipped with the tools to be able to then help people? And I think that could be done better. That's always been my point.
Okay. Well, I was on the Australian Government Dietary Guidelines website earlier today, and I've kind of summarised how they recommend to eat as a diet high in grains, high in vegetables and legumes, low in fat, saturated and unsaturated, low in salt, low in red meat, and this is one thing I found interesting, there's no distinction made between animal fats and seed oils, canola oil, and margarine. So I'm very curious to find out how or what your dietary guidelines look like, if they're different or the same, and some of your thoughts around how you developed them.
Yeah, going back to those guidelines, it's very interesting. Right at the end, they say that this should not be applied to those that are unhealthy fundamentally, and those who are aging. It's built, these pyramids are built, or food pyramids are built for a healthy population. So then the question to ask is, do we have a healthy population? I'd ask you, Simon, if you look around you, from children to elderly people to middle-aged men and women such as you and me, do we have a healthy population? And the answer is probably not. The statistics from America are really quite staggering. They've got a large-scale population-based study in which they extrapolated 90% of their population is metabolically unhealthy. So could you apply a food pyramid such as that to these populations? The answer is no, because they're metabolically unhealthy. They're not well people. Now, where do we fall on that scale? And I don't think we're too far behind. I don't have the exact figures, but I'd say probably 60 to 70% of our population is overweight or obese. 25% of our children are overweight or obese. 60% of doctors are overweight and obese. So really, we don't have a healthy population. In that case, how can we apply that pyramid? And that's always been my point. I do not believe that pyramid is based on perfect evidence. And the issue, though, is that nutritional studies, nutritional science, it is a very, very problematic field, fraught with issues with how they collect the data. And this is the problem. If the data is corrupted, then corrupted by poor quality collection methods, and you've got results that are fundamentally corrupted. So that nutritional guidelines, which basically says reduce things like red meat, that's problematic. Reduce salt, that's kind of problematic, because we know that salt's a critical electrolyte for survival. And so what I would like to see in those nutritional guidelines is removal of the nutrient. I think they allow for poor levels of satisfaction, or what we term satiety. And I think people tend to overeat calories in that sort of context because of a lack of satiety, lack of satisfaction.
Right, so I see you making a distinction between a population who are already healthy versus a population who are sick and need to make a fairly drastic change in order to, overcome their health challenges and actually become healthy. Yeah, I think that's an interesting distinction. So digging a little bit deeper into how you would possibly change the recommendations, or how your recommendations to your clients differ versus the Australian government. What's your personal perspective on, say, red meat consumption?
Yeah, sure. Simon, of course, you can imagine someone in my profession with guidelines that dictate how we manage these sort of people. I'm very, very careful with the way I practice, and this is why I've got a team of people, dietitians who are accredited to give advice, dietitians and nutritionists that are accredited to give advice. So if someone comes to see me with a gut-based issue, often I would point out to them potentially that might be aspects in their diet that's contributing to their issues. And then we may potentially pursue investigations such as endoscopy and colonoscopy to exclude any structural diseases that they might have, like cancers, like diverticular disease, like inflammatory diseases, and so forth. And if that's all clear, my approach tends to be see an accredited dietitian who can give you the advice. And the beauty is I've got a team that's kind of aligned with my philosophy, and we're all about building a nutrient-dense diet for people. And I think it's sad to see the vilification of red meat based on some really problematic guidelines generated by the World Health Organization, which I would challenge, is based on really poor quality evidence. And they basically look to ignore some really quality trials that were done that showed no link, but they went with the poor science. And I think there's issues with that panel that sat down, because there's about 22 of them, of which 14 were sort of vegan or plant-based and spent most of their career trying to sell cookbooks and whatnot. So there was a bit of an agenda in place. And not to sound like a conspiracy theorist, I'm not that. There were issues, there was flaws even before those guidelines were written, if that makes sense. So to classify a pizza full of pepperoni as the same as a beautifully raised grass-fed finished animal, fed on our beautiful pastures here in Australia and places like Tasmania, which I think have some of the best produce, I think is fundamentally flawed. To vilify a macronutrient or a food source which is whole food, basically, like red meat, is just, it's almost to a point of negligent. And whilst the Australian guidelines kind of recommend that, I think it's time to kind of start challenging and start looking at closer at the evidence. I think the bigger issue within our societies are these unrefined foods, these refined foods like pastas and breads and of course the sugary drinks and the high consumption of alcohol. This is the issue. And I think we should be tackling those issues rather than leveling blame at red meat, which our species has consumed for over 3 million years. And we've not had an issue with health like we have had in the last few decades, really. Even if you go back 50 years ago, the lifespan might have been shorter, but the way people died was fundamentally from infection rather than these sort of chronic illnesses that we see now. So, and we've got to remember, like, public health safety was terrible back then. They didn't have vaccinations, and they had poor access to antibiotics. They had issues with sanitation. There was no seatbelts. They had smokers, asbestos, lead, all these sort of things. The public health measures weren't there. But even then, they lived up until the age of 70, up 50, 60 years ago, and potentially even longer. So I think we've got to start questioning what's gone wrong in the last 50 to 60 years. And that's the question, I think, as a population and as a government official, that we've got to start asking ourselves.
Couldn't agree more. Dr. Yoganathan, you talk about sort of challenging convention or questioning things that are, that have been put in place by, say, media, government, World Health Organization. Is it in your nature to be your own truth seeker and to do your own research, to speak about what you believe in? Because unfortunately, your approach is fairly unusual and it's unconventional today, particularly in the medical field.
I'm merely questioning status quo at the moment, right? I'm sort of just saying, can we go on this trajectory? Can we keep going on this trajectory? Do we not need to work alongside good quality dietitians that can bring a new way of thinking, good quality exercise physiologists and exercise trainers that kind of understand the importance and role of muscle in healthcare and how poor quality muscle and loss of muscle in our society is contributing to a lot of these illnesses. That's merely what I'm doing. I think it's not in my nature to be a troublemaker, I suppose, but I've always had an inquiring mind, and I think as a scientist, I've got to remain curious, and I think I would encourage my fellow scientists, and as doctors, we are scientists, we practice one of the oldest fields of science, and I think that curiosity is being lost. We turn to guidelines, but we've always got to keep querying the data and questioning the data and reading deeper. And that's what I've been trying to do.
Fantastic. And Dr. Yoganathan, on your website, it mentions that you and your clinic are big advocates for early detection of bowel cancer. I am by far no expert, and when you sort of explain this stuff to me, you might need to explain it like you're talking to a 7-year-old. But I'm wondering if you could please talk a little bit about early detection of bowel cancer, what it means to you, and how you guys go about your practice.
Sure. For most individuals that are average risk people, which means that there's no significant family history of bowel cancer or whatnot, we advocate sticking to the government-based program, which is the 2-yearly stool test, which is issued after the age of 50. This is not advice for all individuals. Of course, it needs to be personalised based on family history and other risk factors. But I'm hugely supportive of the initiative that the government's got in place with the National Bowel Cancer Screening Program and the stool testing. It's cost effective, it's relatively efficient, and it's acceptable from the population as a stool-based screening tool, which is a lot less invasive than colonoscopy. Colonoscopy is a very costly tool. It's a very effective tool for bowel cancer detection and prevention because we can remove polyps before they become cancers, which is where a lot of these cancers start from, as polyps, basically. So there's various ways to do bowel cancer screening, but the most cost-effective method is the one that government's got in place. The concern, of course, is as we start seeing early bowel cancer, 30-year-olds, the question that will be asked, I think, at a very high level in government is, should the bowel cancer screening be instituted earlier in these groups? Of course, there comes the economic ramifications of all of that as well, because we're functioning within a health system that's already stretched at all levels. So where does the money come from? You know, and that's the problem. So I'm in favour of what the government's got in place with the National Bowel Cancer Screening Program. Do I sense a tsunami of bowel cancer in the future? Yes. As we have these children that are obese and overweight that grow up to be adults that are obese and overweight with a huge exposure over their lifetime to obesity, especially at a very early vulnerable age, we're going to start seeing more and more colorectal cancer emerge very, very early. And it'll be interesting to see what the government does with regards to their screening methods in that time frame.
Right. So early screening and detection has both a kind of humanitarian effect in that people are less likely to suffer from that bowel cancer long time, or you can sort of start preventing it, and then it's also got an economic benefit, because less money is spent on cancer maintenance and surgery, etc.
100%. I think I'm a big favour of the stool test because it essentially detects bowel cancer before it becomes problematic. And it's important to understand that bowel cancer is a really slow-growing tumour in most individuals. It tends to be different in the younger groups. The younger groups tend to have more aggressive types of cancers, in particular bowel cancers. But for most people, it's a polyp. It starts off life as a polyp, and it might spend 5 to 10 years or 5 to 15 years before the thing becomes a cancer. So if you're having frequent stool tests, at some point, hopefully you pick it up either as a polyp or an advanced polyp or as an early colorectal cancer. It is literally one of the easiest cancers to not just treat, but to cure when it's picked up early. And this is why compliance with the stool-based screening test is very important. The data shows that maybe 70% of people won't do the stool test, even though it's a free one sent out by the government. So I'd encourage a lot of the people that receive it to do it. If you haven't received one, which would be unusual, you could get one from your GP or get one from the pharmacy. But the government's got a really good screening program in place, and hats off to what they've done.
And Dr. Yoganathan, the link between red meat and bowel cancer, can you ruminate on that for a little bit?
Yeah, it's very, very problematic, Simon. It's a long story, but I'll try and simplify it as best as possible. This has been questioned for many years. Is there a link between bowel cancer and red meat? So in 2015, the World Health Organization sat down with this panel of 22 people that I alluded to earlier and to determine whether this was a causative agent in colorectal cancer. What they concluded when they looked at 800 what we call epidemiological studies, very weak studies in terms of their quality of evidence. They looked at about 800 of them, and 780 of these studies showed no link. So they focused on the 20 that did show the link, and then they sat down and said, listen, we think processed meat increases the risk of colorectal cancer by 18%, based on 20 really poor quality studies, where 780 studies had shown no link. What they failed to do was they failed to look at really powerful trials like the Women's Health Initiative, and also the polyp study, which were randomized control, which meant they were far more rigorous studies that showed no link between red meat consumption or meat consumption and colorectal cancer. They chose to ignore those studies for whatever reason. So it really makes no sense as to how that panel kind of went about doing things. And the sad thing is, they concluded that processed meat increases the risk of colorectal cancer by 18%, but then lumped in red meat with all of that. We know that people that are consuming processed meats are most likely consuming things like burgers and pizzas, and you can imagine the type of individual that does that. They are less likely to show other good health behaviors. They're more likely to smoke and not exercise and be overweight. I mean, could you imagine being a person in the modern world that consumes a lot of red meat? Most people that are healthy won't do it because of the guidelines. So if you're an individual consuming red meat in this modern age, chances are you've got a lot of other high-risk behaviors because you're essentially a bit of a rebel, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. Sounds like there's a lot of fuzzy kind of one-sided science being played around with there.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you explaining that. That was super clear. I'm wondering if you might be able to give us, and it can be from a very top level, an understanding of perhaps a client who's come to see your clinic who has gastrointestinal issues, and maybe some of the top level changes that you guys might implement, and then maybe some examples of how you guys have been able to help people.
Yeah, it's pretty simple, really, Simon. It may seem simple, but we try and teach them that there are 3 macronutrients: protein, fat, and carbohydrate. We try to teach them within these macronutrients, there's vitamins and minerals. And that's a very simple way of looking at diet. 3 macros, then you've got the vitamins and minerals. We try to teach them foods that are like pastas and breads and so forth. Unless they're fortified with vitamins, they tend to be very, very nutrient poor. In addition, a lot of these foods are refined carbohydrates, and we see this issue with a blood sugar spike and then a dip, and then the people are hungry again. So we try to teach them to eat nutrient-dense foods. Nutrient density can come from fat, carb, and protein. Often it's protein because of the lever, the protein pools, which is satiety, which is satisfaction, basically. We don't want people to be eating 20 meals a day, 10 meals a day, 6 meals a day, constantly just craving food. We find that people that eat a nutrient-dense diet can cut it down to about 2 to 3 meals a day, which is good. The less frequently we eat, the less frequently we're sort of stimulating our insulin, which is a hormone released by the pancreas that then pushes us into storage and allows us not to burn fat. So what we tend to recommend is a nutrient-dense diet that can come from any of those macronutrients. So it's all about personalizing. And I think we're in an era now where people tend to be the extremes. Either it's meat only or veganism. I mean, these are the extremes that we've got in diet. But the reality is we're an omnivorous species of primate, that is really capable of digesting a variety of foods. And we're very, very flexible with that. But I think the thing that we try to teach people is protein, especially quality animal source protein. That is some of the most nutrient-dense food found on the planet today.
Very well said. That's nice and clear. I think a focus on nutrient density is something that I kind of figure most people will get. And it sounds like you guys have developed a really smart way of explaining it in layman's terms, and in a way that people can actually go and apply to their lives and get a real result from, and really improve their health. So yeah, fantastic work. Now for the final question, Dr. Yoganathan, what does a day of your personal eating look like? What foods do you like? Here at Mackenzie's Meats, obviously, we're big advocates for grass-fed beef and lamb, as well as really high-quality pork and chicken. So I'd like to find out a little bit about you and what you like to eat.
Thanks, mate. And again, this is my personal diet. I'm not saying anyone should kind of apply it to themselves for therapeutic benefits. This is my version of how I do things for my age and level of activity and muscle and that. And so what I tend to do is I have a black coffee in the morning, generally, because it's a zero-calorie drink. I'm hopelessly addicted to caffeine, which is a feature of most doctors. Medical school, you don't leave medical. Yeah, that's right. You don't leave medical school without a serious caffeine addiction. So I'll drink to that. So I generally have a black coffee to just as a pre-workout, and then I'll generally do a weight session. I'm not huge on cardio myself. I don't enjoy it. Never really enjoyed it. I love weights, and the fact that at 40 years of age I could still push myself to do it really, and to keep hitting personal highs is a big thing for me. And so that's my morning done, and I might have another coffee after. Usually we'll tend to have lunch on days where I've lifted heavy. Often it will be 3 or 4 eggs with some protein such as beef or lamb with a bit of avocado as on the side, or a mushroom or something like that. I tend to stay clear of things like breads and pastas and refined grains, basically, because I just find that it just doesn't agree with me. I tend to get a bit of a slump after a meal once I've done that with a diet that is primarily sort of animal protein based and a bit of fat. I just feel that my energy levels are just constant through the day. So that's what works for me. I won't eat again till I get back home for dinner. And usually for dinner, I tend to have things like steak and eggs, which is a perfect blend of protein and fat. And I might have some fruit afterwards. I try to go for the low sugar fruits, but I've got a weakness for things like grapes and peaches and stuff like that. So I have a little bit of that. And I usually tend to finish off my day with a sort of a nut-based cereal, which contains macadamias and almonds and stuff like that, just a little bit with a tiny touch of some quality Jersey milk. So that's what works for me. And if I wanted to drop down to a lower body fat percentage for whatever reason, I mean, the only reason would be aesthetic. If I wanted to do that, I would cut out things like milk and nuts and the fruits potentially, and reduce the fat levels as well. But I'm very comfortable with my body fat percentages, what keeps me ideal, and keeps my testosterone ideal. So I just tend to, I'm in that routine. If I reduce my levels of exercise, well, I've got to adjust my food accordingly to that in terms of reduce the caloric intake. And this is the thing people need to understand. Energy from food always has to be earned. There is no such thing as free energy. You've got to earn the energy, and I think movement's really key in that. And it's not just diet. Diet probably makes up 70% of it. 30% comes from the way we move and how we earn that energy.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that. Yeah, I like what you added on at the end there about the relationship between how much energy you're burning and then how much energy you're putting in. It reminds me of Charles Poliquin talking about, you got to earn your carbs. You got to earn that bit of extra energy. But yeah, that was really interesting. And Dr. Yoganathan, where can people find you? Where can they learn more about what you do?
Sure. Yeah. Listen, I'm fairly active on platforms like Facebook and Instagram. I just put out little posts every day on various topics, everything from movement to diet to just all sorts of things, really, whatever comes to mind. So I'm not picky about what I post.
Lots of memes.
Lots of memes. Lots of memes. Because that's kind of a way to engage people. I think you could put out basic science, and my temptation is to do just that because I'm passionate about science, but you won't grab the attention of the public as well as you will with a bit of humor, light humor. So that's what I try to do. starting to be a little bit more active on my website in terms of putting out blogs as well. And I'll definitely look to ramp that up. And I've got my rooms in Castle Hill in Sydney, where myself and my dietitians work out of. Additionally, we've got a branch of that in near Camden in a suburb called Gregory Hills. And we're looking to branch out into other areas like the Southern Highlands and through Sydney and regional Sydney. So really keen to grow as a group of gastroenterologists with the accompanied by this fantastic team of dietitians that we've got behind us, helping us along the way.
Amazing. Well, you're doing really great work. And yeah, we all totally appreciate you sharing this information with us today in a way that we can all understand. And I certainly learned something, and I hope other people did as well. So Dr. Yoganathan, thank you very much for today's discussion. We all really appreciate it.
Pleasure, Simon. Thanks for having me on. You've asked some really good questions, and it was a great pleasure to chat to you.
Thanks, Matt.